Welcome to the Stetzer ChurchLeaders Podcast, where we're helping Christian leaders navigate and lead through the cultural issues of our day. My name is Daniel Yang, the director of the Church Multiplication Institute. And today we're talking to Michael Graham and Jim Davis. Michael's the program director for the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics, associate pastor at Orlando Grace Church, executive director of the Dechurched initiative, and executive director of the podcast As in Heaven.
He's more jobs than I have.
He's got a lot of hats.
All right.
Jim is teaching pastor at Orlando Grace Church, the host of As in Heaven podcast, and serves as a writer for the Dechurched initiative. He and his wife Angela speak for Family Life's Weekend to Remember Marriage Getaways. Their new book, written with Ryan Burge, is The Great Dechurching: Who's Leaving, Why Are They Going, and What Will It Take to Bring Them Back? But before we talk to Michael and Jim, we want to remind you that if you're enjoying our interviews, leave us a review. Now let's go to Ed Stetzer, editor-in-chief of Outreach Magazine and the incoming dean at the Talbot School of Theology.
So writing books with big statistical claims, words like great in them, always gets my interest and my attention, and sometimes my concern. I'm sort of known. Matter of fact, I just finishing up an article. You remember the article a few years ago where those bad pastor stats were out there that, 80% of pastors don't have a single friend and 40% of pastors had an adulterous relationship. I mean, they were just crazy. And they were on this website, still on this website, where at this, listed as its institute. You can actually find it, like the Francis Schaeffer Institute, it's called. And so I just named it right here. And because I'm finishing writing this article up. And all the stats just don't make any sense. And yet pastors quote them. I was in England at a pastor's conference, and the pastor gets up and he says that, he cites these things, and they've backed up a little bit, but they still have all the sites on their all the stats on their webpage. It really is demoralizing to pastors. And so I get concerned. I wrote an article for USA Today when some of the news stories talk about Christianity is dying. And I think it was based on the Pew Forum landmark study they do every 7 years. And USA Today picked the title, it's Survey Fail. That's what they call it, Survey Fail. Christianity is not dying. So, and again, I do this in different places, right? CNN, I've written Washington Post several times. So I get concerned. So when I heard about this book, I think Michael emailed it to me, or somebody eventually through Michael, because I knew his name. He wrote a helpful article that I've been using and writing a book on the future of evangelicalism. And so I get the book and I'm a little skeptical. I actually reach out to Ryan Burge, who, he's done some work for us, contract work for us, and we do some of the stuff together with Glue. Turns out he and Michael are BFFs, so I don't get to confidentially ask Ryan, but that's another story for another day. So Ryan's like, no, and Ryan is, he's got a new book coming out in religion. He's at Eastern Illinois University, good researcher. He's kind of the guy, everyone's seen his little charts he posts all the time. He uses the congressional study all the time. So he's like, okay, good. So then I get the book and I want to walk through it. And I like some of the nuance that's there. So what does Ed Stetzer think about the book? Well, I endorsed it. So this morning, at the time of this recording, I sent in my endorsement. Not that my endorsement is the end all or be all, but I did want to say, coming onto the program, that when it comes to statistical stuff, we don't have on the program folks that I'm not comfortable with, because that's part of what my job is, to help figure this out. It's a very long introduction, but I want you to know that there's some. I might word some things differently. We're going to talk about that. But there is some shifting going on, churn. I'll use the word churn on more than one occasion. But let's jump in with the authors. First, let's hear from Michael. And Michael, a project like this, one of the key things is scope. It's what are you trying to answer? Because you answer too much, you don't really get there. You answer too little, what's the point of the book? What's the scope of the book, and why did you write it?
Yeah, so we conducted a 3-phase survey. The first phase of that survey was basically to figure out how many dechurched adults are there in America and what areas are worth kind of zooming in on. So we did a second phase study, and the goal of that second phase was to compare and contrast the differences and similarities between churched and dechurched persons from all religious traditions. What we saw from that second study warranted further zooming in, and we wanted to get additional data on what was going on with a high degree of granularity among evangelical dechurched in particular. So those were the 3 phases of the study. What we learned from the highest altitude from that first phase was that there were about 40 million adult Americans who used to go to church, who now don't go at all anymore. So dechurched for us is defined as somebody who used to go to church at least once per month and now less than once per year. And so about 15% adult Americans fit that category of used to go at least once per month regularly, now less than once per year. Most of that dechurching has happened in the last 25 to 30 years. And the shape of that dechurching began initially with the mainlines in the 1980s, and then the Catholics were kind of next. And then a lot of that was kind of happening more on the secular left than it was more recently among dechurched evangelicals, which takes shape a little bit more on the secular right, starting with the acceleration of that dechurching more in the mid-late 1990s to present.
Jim, let me come to you real quick, because again, so the idea of dechurched is used to attend church at least once a month, but now no longer. Can you give us an idea of, like, who are they? Like, give us an overview of who is leaving.
Well, that's what we wanted to see. I mean, so when we set this out, we did this for Orlando. We live in Orlando, where Ed grew up, as I've more recently learned. Well, you grew up in New York and spent your teenage years here. And Orlando, we knew anecdotally that the most of the people we did ministry with used to go to church and no longer do. And we, in our As in Heaven podcast, we didn't want to just have anecdotal evidence. We wanted to commission a true sociologist in Ryan Burge to be able to help us to understand quantitatively what we're looking at. And so at the very beginning, we wanted to prove or disprove this thesis, which we'll get to your great language later, Ed. But we are currently in the largest and fastest religious shift in the history of our country. And we proved it. And then through the successive studies that Mike was talking about, we were able to understand by entering all this data into what's called machine learning that Mike and Ryan can explain a lot better than me. But we were able to produce 5 different profiles of dechurched people, 5 very distinct profiles. So backing up a little bit, we realized that, okay, the dechurched first separate into one of 2 categories that we call the casually dechurched or the dechurched casualties. The casually dechurched are what it sounds like. They didn't intentionally dechurch. They moved to Orlando or some other city and just got busy and got new rhythms. And maybe they still have a value for church, but they decided they weren't going to go anymore. Maybe their kids got into teenage years, athletics took over, travel sports. COVID obviously greatly increased this casually dechurched group, where people got used to not going to church for 6, 12, 18 months, depending on the state that you lived in, and then just didn't come back. So that's the casualty side. The casualty side, there is an actual pain point. We talk in our podcast a lot with Justin Holcomb, our mutual friend, about these specific pain points of pastoral falls, politics, sexual ethics, abuse in the church, things like that. So there is a pain point. So you have those 2 categories, and then you have the 5 groupings. 4 are evangelical dechurch groupings, and then we've lumped Roman Catholics and mainline together because they're pretty much almost identical. So who's leaving? Those would be the categories that we haven't explained in depth. We do in the podcast and the book. But the hope is, and we're beginning to do some seminars here in our own church, is that people could have these categories and in about 5 questions understand, oh, this is who I'm looking at. Because depending on why somebody stopped going to church, that's going to influence how we minister to them. Now, lastly, let me introduce caveats. Obviously, God is in control of it all. We believe he's doing the work. Nobody's going to worship him without a regenerative act on his part in our hearts. He is going to keep his sheep, but at the same time, he told us there would be weeds, among the wheat, that we should not be surprised when there are people who look like they are in the kingdom and they are not. And so certainly some of this is just revealing what is already true, spiritually speaking. Having said that, the study has been very encouraging about who it is that's leaving, and among big parts of them, their willingness to come back.
Yeah, and I think it's, people should know that the book, by the way, the book is The Great Dechurching, who's leaving, why they're going, and what will take to bring them back. That Orlando is an illustration, but don't get distracted that you think that Orlando's the focus of it. But for me, it really connects because, we, New York City sort of went bankrupt. So my dad was a Union iron lather, my grandfather, fire battalion chief. Anyway, everyone just sort of moved to Florida. It was kind of the law there for my grandfather when he retired. And But we moved there. We didn't have anything. We lived in a house in Orlando without air conditioning. We had a big fan that they said would suck all the warm air out. And it did. It just brought new warm air in. But anyway, and, public assistance at times. And yet heard the gospel there and came to faith in Christ at a little charismatic Episcopal church, a Good Shepherd there in Maitland. Then went out to be part of a church plant with Greg Brewer, who's now the bishop of the Diocese of Central Florida, Church of the New Covenant in Winter Springs. And in all that, man, it was a booming religious environment. So I would go, so this whole church plant grew to hundreds. My first job was I was the sexton, SEXTON, of this Episcopal church. It basically meant I was the janitor. But this church blew up in size. And I was going every Tuesday night to Calvary Assembly, which is this huge building that you drive by. It's got 5,000 seats in it. And I talked to the pastor there. It's mostly empty, used for venues. It was this bastion. We used to do this thing. Now these festivals have sort of declined. We used to go to these things called Jesus Orlando, and tens of thousands of people would come. I was there with my girl, in high school. And today you go back and, some people, my friend Steve Childers and others, calls, Orlando, the graveyard of church planting, even after Vision 360, which, Al Weiss and everyone was going to plant these churches. And so I do find it interesting because it's not everyone's experience everywhere, but Orlando, in some cases, could be a bellwether of what's to come, and in some ways, what's coming. All right. So, but one of the things that I early on wanted to see is we have, again, we talked about 40 million. It's not that they've surveyed 40 million people. That's an important distinction. But 40 million people through representative sampling would project to be 40 million people. Now, if 40 million people leave a church, does that mean there are 40 million less people? What's the churn that's going on? Talk to us a little bit about that. We'll throw that to Michael, and then and either one of you can weigh in. So what does that mean? Are we just 40 million less? Are we 40 million smaller?
Well, obviously you have a lot of complex factors of things like immigration, people who, have children and raise them, in the church. So you have all the different, demographics of population shifts and those different kinds of things. If you read the most recent, Southern Baptist Convention report, obviously their membership numbers are down about 400,000 from, the year before.
Largest decline in history.
Yep, we just crossed about 2 years ago the 50% mark of where 50% of Americans, more than 50% of Americans, for decades and decades, went to church, and so usually those figures were hovering around the 70% of Americans went to church for the large part of the 20th century, and even into a little bit into the early 21st century. But now those figures have gone below 50% now. So in terms of how many people are churched in America, it is now in active decline in terms of that dechurching is definitely impacting the total volume of people who are going to church.
You're talking to pastors and church leaders on this podcast, and can you help them understand, like, why are people leaving the church? You talked about first the mainline decline, and then also the Catholic decline, and evangelicalism probably is holding steady, but also maybe seeing, you mentioned Southern Baptist, a little bit of disenrollment maybe. But what's the reason why you're finding people are actually leaving and just stopping attending church altogether?
So historically, it's really interesting to go back to the Cold War, because the end of the Cold War, it was a critical impetus in dechurching. So the 1990s were this really pivotal moment for the dechurching crisis that we're experiencing. So before the fall of the Soviet Union, to be American was to be Christian. I mean, if you talk to people a little bit older than us, if somebody said, I'm not a Christian, it was not uncommon for people then to ask, well, are you a communist? I mean, it was just such a jump that seems weird now, but it was under the Eisenhower administration, not coincidentally, that In God We Trust was added to our money, Under God was added to the pledge, because our government wanted to perpetuate this idea that to be American is to be Christian. And we're fighting this battle against this atheistic evil over on the other side of the world. So when the Soviet Union fell, there was now freedom to say, to be both American and not Christian. So that was a really important thing that contributed to the dechurching. And then, of course, the rise of the internet. People don't really attribute a lot of that to the 90s, but in 1994 was when you had your first internet cafes opening. That's when you could go, on your own and begin to research views that are different than what you grew up with. Most libraries and public schools by the end of the 90s had access to the internet. And then you had this polarization, this political and religious polarization where there's a lot of overlap that really contributed to people saying, gosh, if I have to choose between these extremes, I just think I'm out. So the 1990s was incredibly pivotal to what's going on. Ryan Burge has done a lot of really good work on the Trump era and its contribution, COVID and its contribution. But again, they really, there's more freedom in our society now to say you're not Christian, or to say I'm a Christian, but my spirituality is private. And I don't need the church that I'm baptized into. And so you have, those are larger historical narratives that have happened in addition to the casually dechurching and the dechurch casualties that we've mentioned. What's interesting, here's a reason, I think this is a really interesting thing that Burge has done a lot of work on. We commissioned him to do, affirms this. What's not causing people to leave the church is higher secular education. So you are much more, the more educated a Christian is, the more likely you are to continue in the faith. I think it's only 3% of evangelicals with a master's degree have actually dechurched. So I think that's important to say in the conversation. That's not the contributing boogeyman that we've made it out to be over the past 40 years or whatever.
Yeah, this has been something that they talked about in the UK for a while. C.S. Lewis wrote about this and others, is that in the centers of education and learning, they actually have, I don't know if they've done well. Britain's a very secular environment, but it's actually in poorer and uneducated and rural areas, not that those three always correlate together, that they've struggled to reach the common man, I think is what one author said. Okay, so just for clarity on a couple things. When we're talking about being in the 70s, the peak of church membership was late 40s at 76%, and now we're down to 47%. If I'm just going by the Gallup numbers, so membership has experienced that decline, whereas attendance has actually not experienced that collapse. Right, in 1939, 1940, it was about 41% of Americans said that last week they attended church or synagogue or mosque, and today it's at about 30. I'm looking at my chart here, 30%. So don't misunderstand, that's 10% less. That's a big deal. But we want to also temper that what we're talking about is nobody does real research believes that American Christianity is collapsing or dying, but the reality is there are some significant troubling trends. The rise of the nuns has caught all the news. And I think, I could be wrong, but I think your phrase, the Great Dechurching, will catch on, because I do think it is a great number of people who have dechurched over the last few decades. It's important to note, you mentioned early on, it was when I did the first analysis of this, there was a very strong correlation from disidentifying as a Christian to disidentifying from mainline Protestantism. Now that's shifted some. So we're seeing those shifts take place. Okay, you set a kind of a positive note. You set a positive note in this, that there's potential to reach them. I would also remind us that there is churn and people are being reached. New people who didn't drop out of church, but who never were in church. The Molly Worthen podcast got a lot of people's attention in around the interwebs. So there's churn, but the churn is churning down, and that's the key. So there is a great dechurching, some people coming in, but more people going out. Yet you set an encouraging note. Let's go to Michael first. Let's have both of you address it. Let's go to Michael first. How can you be encouraged in those kinds of situations?
Well, the single most encouraging thing about this entire research is that well over half the people that we surveyed are willing to actively return to church today. And many of those people actually believe that they will. So we've kind of categorized folks in one of three buckets in our own minds, just kind of pastorally and a little bit in the book. It looks like in the data, there's people who just need a little bit of a nudge to return to church. These are people that probably, if you text them, they'll probably come to, hey, I'm going to come by your, can I come by your, your house, on this Sunday and, take you to church with me? Like, there's a large degree of people that fit that first category of they just need a nudge. There's a second group of people that probably need your dinner table. And that group just needs, they just need some movement into their life from a relational intimacy standpoint. And those folks look like, yeah, they're very willing to return to church. They just need to have some questions answered and need to have some experiences that are maybe a little bit better with people who are associated with, church-going folks. And then there's kind of a third category of people who probably aren't going to return to church for a wide variety of reasons. But it's good to, I'm of the personal opinion that I don't like to shed relationships based on any kind of external factors or decisions that people make. So I think it's good to stay in people's lives. But I think that the good news, though, is that, of those 40 million people, over 20 million of them are willing to return to church today. And the reasons why that they said are very, by and large, very reasonable. In many ways, they just want to have better relationships interpersonally with other individuals. And then they want to be connected to healthier institutions. So I think those are the two big categories of, places where we have opportunity to learn and grow and do better. And it's just, it's relational wisdom on the interpersonal standpoint. And it's building churches and institutions that that promote a gospel that's true, good, and beautiful all at the same time. If we do those things, lots of people are going to return, like millions and millions of them. So that's where there's just tremendous hope. And most of those things that just kind of outlined, do better, be better, in terms of relational wisdom and build healthier churches. Well, those are things that are within our control. So that's good news.
What I'm hearing from this conversation is there are a lot of people that are leaving or leaving cultural Christianity, but maybe not yet fully immersed in convictional Christianity. Maybe it's important to nuance that. And Jim, so maybe you can speak to this. Like, do you think it's important to nuance away, like people aren't deconverting or deconstructing at the high rates that maybe we're seeing people leaving the church because they're leaving cultural Christianity? Is it worth nuancing that? Because I do see the evangelistic opportunity if people are just leaving what you just said, Jim, or Michael, they want better, healthy institutions. It seems to me that there's a great opportunity for evangelism if we can recognize that people are leaving cultural Christianity. What are your thoughts around that, Jim?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And that's why we've chosen the language, the Great Dechurching, because we can't call it the Great Deconversion. Only about a quarter are really done from our research. And when you focus on dechurched evangelicals, their orthodoxy scores, depending on the particular primary doctrine, whether it's the divinity of Jesus, inspiration of Scripture, the core doctrines that we have, dechurched evangelicals scored higher than those who still go to church. And now, of course, that includes mainline Roman Catholic, things like that. But all signs point to them still being Christians. So we believe there's a great discipleship opportunity. So, I think of people who, well, let me do this. You have the old sociological categories of belief, belong, and behave. With this group, where they really feel the longing is in the belonging category. Their belief and behavior, a lot of them, they match, and in some cases are better than those who are still going to church. But they feel the belonging that was so clear in our research. They might not know exactly why they feel what they feel. The way that I've thought about it, I lived in Europe for 5 years, and we would every now and then have the opportunity to go onto a U.S. Air Force base or Army base. And the moment you step back on, the sirens make the right noise, and you have Pizza Huts and fine establishments like Taco Bell and free refills, and it just looks American. And even though you're thousands of miles from home, you feel like you're home. And that's what worship is made to be. We're not, it's the already not yet. And there's a belonging that we long for in our souls that God has created for us, especially for Christians. And so there's a discipleship opportunity that a church in Columbia, Missouri called The Crossing, an EPC church, who really gave us this research was expensive, and they greatly assisted us in funding this research. So we gave them the executive summary, and they looked at this discipleship opportunity, and they looked for the lowest hanging fruit that Mike was talking about. These people who not only know they should go back, believe they will go back. And they created a campaign to identify them and invite them back. In just a few months, they have hundreds of new people worshiping with them who were formerly dechurched. So with a group of people, if we know how to identify them, I think the discipleship opportunities are really great.
Fascinating. Okay. So, and important as well. Okay. So I think it's probably worth nuancing or detailing some of what Daniel said, and you guys have already talked about as well. Let me remind everybody that the title of the book is The Great Dechurching: Who's Leaving, Why Are They Going, and What Will It Take to Bring Them Back? So that the Great Dechurching is not, and this is part of the challenge, is that we conflate things. We see the news, particularly the Christian news, of deconversion. And there might be, the sons of or daughters of prominent Christian leaders. And so we see that, and there's been some of that. Our colleague here at Wheaton, Michael Lee, had him write an article for Outreach Magazine. He did his PhD dissertation on missionaries and pastors who've deconverted. So that's a real thing. Don't misunderstand. That really happens. That statistically is small in the context of the whole. And many people who are dechurching had loose bonds to start with. One of the things I've talked about, I won't have time to go through it all, but if you're interested, you can go to my Outreach Magazine column on the thirds and of church post-COVID. The back third of the church, if we see them as the least involved, they were the loosely connected, and they mostly disconnected during, particularly if you're in a high shutdown state, in the last few years. So loosely connected people have become mostly disconnected, and that's a pattern that we see recurring. But they didn't leave mad in many cases. They didn't leave hurt in many cases. There are cases that left mad and they left hurt and they changed their theological view. So can you look at this 40 million people and give us sort of broad, and this is US, by the way, for those of you listening, there'll be similar numbers in other countries, but keep in mind the US has a high religiosity. So the numbers would be some ways different than Canada. It's kind of post some of these things. Australia, we have listeners around the world. But in the US context with 40 million people, kind of look at what are some of those categories, chunks of people. You do that in the book. What are some of the chunks of people how you would describe these leavers?
Yeah, so great question. So of the 40 million people who have, stopped going to houses of worship in the United States, about 15 million of them roughly are leaving evangelical contexts. And then within that, we have 4 different profiles. And those profiles can break down to basically, the first profile is about half of the people who left. These are people that we called cultural Christians. These are people that do not look regenerate from a doctrinal standpoint. Only 1% of them said that Jesus is the Son of God. The second group, that's about 8 million people. The second group is mainstream dechurched evangelicals. These people look very orthodox. They only dechurched in the last 3 or 4 years. 98% of them say that Jesus is the Son of God. Their orthodoxy score on stuff like Nicene Christianity is even higher than people that still go to church. 100% of this group are willing to return to church today. A third group are what we call evangelicals. This group also has a very high orthodoxy score, but this group is very allergic to racism, misogyny, church abuse, sexual abuse, these different kinds of things. This group has more of that church hurt and are more of the kind of dechurched casualties that that Jim alluded to before. Of the 40 million people, about 30 million of them dechurched casually, and about 10 million dechurched from a casualty standpoint. 0% of this group are willing to return to an evangelical church, but many of them actually are willing to return to a different expression of the faith. Some have deconverted, but by and large, most of them still look like, at least from a doctrinal standpoint, look pretty relatively orthodox. And then there's a fourth group that's really interesting. We didn't let our algorithm, the machine learning algorithm, see ethnicity, but there's a long shadow in the data, and there's a group that's 100% non-white. That's the BIPOC dechurched group. Fascinating group, highest income, highest education of any of the groups. And this group dechurched a long time ago, very male as well. So there's over a million African American men in this group. They dechurched around Y2K, average income, over $200,000 a year. Highest degrees. Really interesting group in terms of who they are, why they left. So those are just some of the kind of the high bullet points. If you're interested in any of that at all, the best place I can before the book comes out, I can point you to a podcast episode that we recorded and published on May 8th, season 3, episode 2 of the podcast As in Heaven. That's a podcast done by Jim and I and 2 other members.
Let me just say that we'll put that in the link for the show notes as well. Perfect. So people can. I'll say that this is the podcast that Michael recommended.
Yeah. This is just the episode with Ryan Burge. And so all we do in that episode is unpack all these different profiles in detail.
Cool. I think we've all had an episode with Ryan Burge, just like you got to have interviews for something, but he's doing good work.
Yeah. Hey, Jim, let me ask you, as a local church pastor, leading in the evangelical tradition, the both of you at Orlando Grace, talk about, from your perspective, and maybe you have some anecdotal, ways to talk about this, but for those who have left the church, for some, it is about like, oh, okay, I'm not receiving community, or I don't agree with the teacher anymore. For others, it's like they've transferred their sources of authority to other things and other conservative things. So, for instance, there's the rise of Jordan Peterson. Some people see Joe Rogan as somewhat conservative adjacent. Ben Shapiro, sure. these other figures. Where are you seeing people transfer their, in a sense, allegiance to, if it's no longer the Bible, the church, the pastor? Where are you seeing people going?
Well, I think first I want to affirm what you're saying, that the dechurching we're seeing on the secular right is significant. I mean, it's just, I don't think people realize how significant that is. And people, we're going to want to worship something. And so in the absence of worshiping, so I don't want to be too demeaning, because this is happening unconsciously. Maybe they wouldn't say they worship these things, but something takes the priority in our hearts. And I think especially with the volatility and the fear that we've seen over the past few years, people on the secular right who are dechurching are seeking stability and security in the things that you're naming. But I will also say, I think people are putting their comfort and stability in their kids' athletics. I think this is, so anecdotally, since you asked, I had a mom come up and ask me, who doesn't go to our church, sweet person, ask when I would do a Saturday night service, because in the craziness, I think they have 3 kids at the time in 9 sports leagues, and they just Sunday morning's never available, but about once a month, Saturday night is. And I said, man, if I have 4 kids in my home, if I'm having a Saturday night service, I'm disqualified to be leading that service at this point. But I talked to her about, like, where is what do you want most for your children? Because if you want them to go to church and they're raised outside of the church and they're shown that sports are the priority, how are we going to have the expectation that once they leave our home, they're going to have a different set of priorities? So I actually see now, again, my community, 4 kids in my home, this is where I swim the most. Sure. But certainly, going back to the beginning, we saw conspiracy theories taking people away, people who wanted us to hand out worship, voter guides and worship during the 2020 election. And just the stuff that we would never do, and we should be able to have our priorities in order. Does that get at the question you were asking?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it shows that there's a lot of different reasons why conservative people leave the church. Some of it is very pragmatic, and some of it is, ideology. And I think we're seeing that, across the board. Yeah, even in an individual congregation, we're seeing that spectrum played out. So
yeah, you talked a little bit before we came on about how some of that played out in your congregation. Just a couple of things, though, to frame around that. I do think that people can and do listen to Jordan Peterson and are engaged and involved in their local church, and actually might find some of his pushback on cultural narratives to be to be helpful and part of what they believe, but their local church is the community that they're deeply committed to, just as I think there'll be some people who might listen to somebody who's more progressive on some issues of race or issues of whatever example I could give. But let's use that example for just a moment and still be a part of a thriving local congregation that's teaching the Word of God and focused on those things. And I know we're not saying that's not the case. However, we also have seen that major ideological movements can be off ramps out of church faith and practice. And I've talked about it as the great sort. People are sorting themselves ideologically out of their churches, left and right. They're being discipled by their cable news choices, spiritually shaped by their social media. And the end result is, in some cases, they're dechurching in the process. And it's probably too simplistic to say left and right, because there's all kinds of paths. You use sports, right? So is that an ideology? It certainly is an all-consuming reality that then becomes off-ramps out of the life of the church. And you should keep in mind that the authors of the Great Dechurching, who's leaving, why they're going, and what it will take to bring them back, are people who believe in the church, who, like us, think it's a good thing that people are engaged and involved in the church. So off-ramps out of the church, if it doesn't lead to another faith community, are not our desire. What you talk about a couple of things here a lot of things that I think are helpful in the Great Dechurching. What you found is probably is obviously extremely important. What are key takeaways and action steps for them? Because I don't want to just talk about some of the realities. And I would say too, there's a lot here. We're leaving a lot on the table. So when this interview comes out, we're gonna we'll tweet it, we'll share it, we'll share some quotes from the book, that kind of stuff. But I do want to encourage you to get the book, because most books should be an article, and most articles should be a tweet. In the case of the Great Dechurching, it really does have some nuance that I want to encourage you to walk through as well. So what are the key takeaways and action steps? We'll start with Jim and then end with Michael.
Well, I appreciate the way you said that. We as we're writing this book, let me say our goal is, we're basing this on real sociological academic research, but Mike and I are not academicians. We're not scholars. We're pastors taking this information and sorting it through the rubric that we have here. And so as we wrote this book, we actually had the opposite feeling. We felt like, man, a lot of these chapters should be their own books. Yeah. And so our hope is that we would just start a discussion. And we've had people come to us and say, hey, would you want to co-author another book on this part of dechurching? And our answer, at least for right now, is no, you go do it. This is your lane. We want people to start to build. We want to start a national conversation. But some of the things, to get back to your question, we need to exercise relational wisdom. We need to help people grow in their awareness and ability to minister to people. We've talked a lot in our context about how the counseling in some ways is the new apologetic, because in the 20th century, we were really good at just stating truth. What's true. But that came at the expense of active listening that lends itself to the good and beautiful. So we spend a lot of time on that. Of course, as we've said a couple times, a lot of people just need a nudge. Invite somebody to your home, ask them about their spiritual journey, invite them to go with you. Because a lot of people were saying, under reasons they would come back, a friend invites me, there's a good community, there's a good pastor. I mean, those are pretty low-hanging fruit there. Student ministry is a really big one, investing in student ministry. I was listening to actually a non-Christian psychiatrist recently talk, and he was talking about how between the ages of 13 and 25, because he would use evolution as his basis. I'll nuance mine and the way I interpret it in a second, but kids, they want to leave the home, so they are disinclined to listen to their parents. His point was, your friend's parents could say the same thing and they like it and it's wise and smart. Your parents say it and it's, in some cases, stupid. So I would say God made us to launch. Sin having entered us makes that process more volatile than it was designed to be. But this is why our children need to be in a community where they are being told the same things that we're telling them by other people, because I do think that they are made to leave, and because of sin, we need to be in Not that community was a result of sin, but it's another added benefit in light of our fallen nature. We need to prioritize mental health in the church. And so this can look bringing counselors who are licensed counselors or biblical counselors into your context that people have access to. When I'm preaching on certain topics, I'm running this by mental health experts in our community to understand how to talk about it the right way. My wife is a mental health professional. Leaning into the holistic gospel. This gets at the true and the good and the beautiful part. And then we spend some time at the end of the book talking about embracing exile. The norm for this is a hard conversation, because I'm thankful that we have the opportunity in Christendom to vote against things like abortion, to be able to have a voice. And I'm not saying I don't want to have those things, but we are saying the norm for God's people has been exile. Abraham, Babylon, the early church, Acts 2, this has been the norm. The global East right now, I mean, what we've experienced is unique, but there are actually a lot of blessings to be had for God's people when we are exercising our influence from the margins, not from the center. We talk a little bit about this with David Platt in our episode on political syncretism and dechurching. But I said a few years ago, I remember saying from the pulpit something I didn't expect to be very controversial, but I said, I think a lot of my ministry, Lord willing, if I could be here for 20, 25 years, and if I can, a lot of my ministry will be walking white people through the loss of power, white Christians through the loss of power in our society. I just thought that wouldn't be very controversial. It was extremely controversial. And that's what kind of got us going down this road of what do our people not understand, that statement is so scary to them. And how can we be encouraged by the word of God and what it says when Christians are not the main power holders in society?
Oh, you've just broken up such a can of worms here right at the end of our podcast. And we could have this conversation for a couple of more hours, because not everyone thinks that. Some people think we need to fight back, push back. There's all kinds of proposals of what that looks like. But again, this is an interview, and so let me leave that there, because I think that's a key part of the book, the embrace of exile, which is actually, just so people know, is kind of a recurring theme in missiological literature. And if you read the book, you'll see they're kind of influenced by some of the missional missiological literature. Mike Frost wrote a book called Exile. There's a Kinnaman Exile. There's a lot of this language that's there, contested in interesting ways in the last year or so. And it'll be interesting to see where that goes. Michael, last word to our audience. Pastors and church leaders hearing the two words Great Dechurching can be, maybe in some way, is demoralizing. They want to be faithful to the gospel, and they'll probably be willing to do that if it goes down, it'll go down with the ship for so many of them. But they also want to be fruitful. Is there a path to fruitful ministry in an age of great dechurching? Give us the last words.
There absolutely is. And it's no different than, kind of what we said kind of throughout this interview. It's us as pastors equipping our people with greater relational wisdom on an interpersonal standpoint. And then from an institutional standpoint, making better local churches. So we do that when we emphasize the truth, goodness, and beauty of the gospel at the same time. So as pastors, what does it look like to help people with their relational wisdom? In the book, we unpack, there's 6 key awarenesses that I think if you possess these 6 key awarenesses to some degree at all, you become somebody who is magnetic, I think, with respect to how your faith is communicated to others. And those 6 key awarenesses are God awareness, self-awareness, others awareness, awareness of how other people perceive or experience you, emotional awareness, and cultural awareness. And I think people that possess, these 6 things to any real significant degree, they're able to navigate hard and complex situations and conversations with deftness and with persuasiveness and with a magnetic quality to them. And I think so many of the reasons why people have chosen to leave church have boiled down to relationships that have disappointed them and churches that have disappointed them. And some of that is also just the casual piece as well as is being there in the mix. But in terms of like when people are communicating to us why they're willing to return, they're just looking for a good community and they're looking for a healthy local church. And I think when we grow as individuals and as church leaders, we help. That has to start with us. We have to be, growing in ourselves always as well in these kinds of things. And when we work not just in our ministries, but when we work on our ministry and in building healthier local churches, when we do these two things together on the individual and institutional level, we're going to create something that many of those 20 plus million people who are willing to return to church today are going to say, yes, I'm going to opt in to that again. So that's the hope.
We've been talking to Michael Graham and Jim Davis. Be sure to check out their new book, The Great Dechurching. Who's leaving? Why are they going? And what will it take to bring them back? Thanks again for listening to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast. You can find more interviews as well as other great content from ministry leaders at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast. And again, if you found our conversation today helpful, we'd love for you to take a few moments, leave us a review that'll help other ministry leaders find us and benefit from our content. Thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.